The Lever. Subscriber-supported journalism that holds power accountable.
From The Lever's reader-supported newsroom, this is Lever Time. I'm Arjun Singh. Since the founding of the Republic, America has always considered itself unique from the rest of the world. That term, American exceptionalism, has justified wars and invasions, and why some think the United States should dominate the global pecking order. Lately, what seems to make the US exceptional, though, is that it's allowed an incendiary right-wing reality television star to upend its political system. But to say that's unique to the US is, of course, a classically exceptional and incorrect statement. Right-wing nationalism has emerged in countries like Hungary and India, and like Trump, these leaders have taken advantage of popular anger against democratic institutions and channeled that into an often nativist and belligerent form of governance. But how did we arrive here? What's happened in the last decade that's led to the rise of a new crop of leaders who are vowing to remake their countries and turn their backs on traditional democracy? In his new book, The Reactionary Spirit, How America's Most Insidious Political Traditions Swept the World, Vox senior correspondent Zack Beauchamp explores that history and tries to understand how this became a global phenomenon. Today on Lever Time, I'll sit down with Zack to discuss the rise of right-wing governments from Trump in the US to Netanyahu in Israel, and how they all share elements with an anti-democratic ideology that was born here in the United States. So, to get into it, Zack, we're talking at an interesting time, although I feel like the last 6 years have been speaking at an interesting time. But I'm talking to you at this kind of unique moment where we're having an upending of the U.S. presidential election. But in particular, there's been a lot of, thought and hand-wringing in a way over the usage of Democrats kind of campaigning that Donald Trump presents an existential threat to democracy, that, preventing him from coming to power is really the stakes of these elections. Ever since the assassination attempt on Trump, there has been some hand-wringing about whether that went too far or not. To kind of cut through that noise, though, as someone who reports on and has been researching Democratic backsliding, when you look at the state of kind of the U.S. in the Trump era, in Trump's presidency, after Trump's presidency, and what you hear from Trump right now, how do you think about the idea of Democratic backsliding and existential threat to democracy? Is that something the U.S. has been in a moment of? Is it new to us right now? What do you sort of make of that?
Yeah. So the answer to your question, the simple answer is yes. The United States is in the midst of a fight over its democracy's survival. That is, I think, clearly true. Mm-hmm. But to understand why that's true, we need to go a bit into American history, as I do in the book, right? Yeah. So the argument that I make is that from the outset, the United States has been defined by two competing political traditions, right? One is democratic, right? It's all what you see in civics classes and the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, etc. And the other is, I think, much less well understood, but is a descendant of European feudalism that grew up in the American South as a consequence of slavery, right? It was an ideology that was designed to legitimize slaveholding, and it took from really ideology promulgated by the Stuart Kings in England, that people have a natural place in human society. There's a natural order to things. And that ideology has evolved over time, but what it has stayed true to is this idea that there needs to be a social hierarchy, and that social hierarchy can be enforced even at the expense of democracy and democratic rights. And it's not explicit on that point. In fact, one of the hallmarks of the American authoritarian tradition is how well it adopts democratic language for undemocratic means. That's been true for hundreds of years. But what we're seeing right now is, and this waxes and wanes throughout American history depending on circumstances, and we're seeing a waxing, right? We're in the midst of, and really have been since I'd say at least since Barack Obama was elected president the first time, an upsurge in the American authoritarian tradition. It has been gaining in adherence. Its penetration of mainstream institutions has been increasing. And now, I mean, I don't want to say that if Trump is reelected, American democracy is over, because I don't necessarily think that's true.
Sure.
But I do think that Trump could do significant damage if he comes back to the presidency, in ways that are predictable and scary.
So you titled your book The Reactionary Spirit, and sort of one of the things that you write about here is that this is an American phenomenon, if you will, a uniquely American thing. What is the reactionary spirit, and in what ways is this an American, I was going to say problem, I suppose you could call it a problem, but an American concept?
Yeah, so it's important to be clear on the elements of it that are and aren't especially American, right? Mm-hmm. So the reactionary spirit is something that can happen anywhere. And in fact, I argue is at the heart of conflict between of conflict inside democracies around the world right now. At its essence, it is born out of a dilemma that conservative factions face inside democratic politics, right? Conservative parties, generally speaking, are dedicated to protecting certain elements of the status quo, of the political status quo, including the distribution of resources, social status, who's up and who's down, whose art is valued and who isn't, right? Like these notions of the way that the country should be and how it looks. Mm-hmm. That's the concern of a conservative movement, right? Or a conservative party. And they have two ways to go about doing it. One is to defend the elements of the status quo they think are valuable through democratic means, right? Through the system, the political system. And if they lose, then they lose, and they try to do their best to accommodate themselves to defeat. Or they believe that upholding these standards, this existing set of social orders, is so valuable, so important, that democracy is secondary, and often really is, if democracy is empowering social change, then it needs to be undercut or even toppled entirely. For a variety of reasons, which we can talk about in a second, this is taking root and becoming especially powerful in a number of different countries across the world. What is distinct and distinctly American right now is the way in which the reactionary spirit is manifesting. You know, I mentioned a second ago that the American reactionaries have always been adroit at masking themselves in democratic language. That is historically abnormal, right? So in most places and most times, people say, if I'm against democracy, I'm against democracy. You know, fascists weren't like, well, you know, I'm gonna pretend to respect the results of elections. No, they said elections were bad. Right. We should get rid of them. And that's not the way that reactionaries operate today.
Yeah.
Right. And the United States pioneered the tradition of using democratic language and ideas to hide an ultimately authoritarian political project. And that's what's gone global today. While the reactionary spirit is inherently universal, its manifestation as a kind of its democratic veneer is American, and that's what we've exported to the rest of the world.
One thing that I wonder is, why does this manifestation of reaction seem to fall in right-wing politics a lot? You see it in Orban, you see it in Modi, you see it in Trump, and you know, it's interesting that it does seem to fall under a lot of things under the right-wing political bubble, even though, you know, a handful of those things might not necessarily mean authoritarianism. I mean, free market capitalism, pro-business kind of policies, but you do see this coming from the right a lot right now. Is that just unique to this moment, or why do you think that it's so common on the right? Or am I wrong in that maybe there are liberal and even left-wing governments that have had a reactionary spirit to them?
Well, I think the reactionary spirit specifically is a right-wing phenomenon, right? Like when I'm talking about it, I'm talking about the way in which the right becomes authoritarian. And that's not to say there isn't left-wing authoritarianism. Of course there is, right? Anyone who would try to deny that would be crazy, I think. I mean, you would have had to forget about the Soviet Union or current day Venezuela. But the way in which left-wing movements become authoritarian or are lured into authoritarianism is different, right? It's not that they see social change happening and they say, too much change, we have to stop it, we need to break the system. It's kind of the reverse of that, right? Yeah. They see not enough change happening and they say, things are still bad. We need to break the system if we want them to get better. We need to seize control if we want them to get better. And era, our particular time, is one of tremendous social change, right? Not in ways that will, fully satisfy someone who is a real socialist, right? In some ways, there's been backwards progress on economic issues, though that's the extent to which of that is debatable. But what really has happened, or at least that's true for some European democracies, and North American democracies. What really has happened across the democratic world has been a tremendous amount of specifically social change.
Yeah.
Right. The status of minorities, the participation of women in politics, the open visibility of LGBT individuals. Like, all of this is relatively new to democratic politics, and it represents democracy starting to take its founding idea of political equality seriously, right? Like, I mean, I've been referencing the Declaration of Independence a lot, but all men are created equal had explicit caveats, right? Men, and implicit caveats. Black men weren't allowed in, and non-property owning men in a lot of places weren't allowed to vote either at that point in time, let alone, and there are issues of access for religious minorities in the early US, etc. And a lot of the second half of the 20th century has seen a tearing down of those barriers across countries, right? And really across the democratic world, just a complete global social revolution.
Yeah.
And to me, that is what set the stage for an upsurge in the reactionary spirit, is the way, not just in which that there was social change inside democracies, but countries that weren't democracies became democratic, creating the conditions for even more social change, because democracy empowers people who want to change their lot in society to vote in such a way as to change said lot. And, sometimes that challenge was economic. There were people at the top of the financial hierarchy who were really upset about that the threats to, let's say, increase tax rates or make it such that people that they owned, literal, slaves, were no longer slaves anymore in the case of the 19th century. What's happening right now is really a transformation, a revolution in social attitudes. And that's why we're seeing so much right-wing anti-democratic activity and so little relatively left-wing democratic activity. It's because it's not a time of social stagnation. It's a time of social change.
There's one sort of viewpoint that, and I think this applies a lot to America, but in other places, which is that you're seeing kind of the rise of an economic populism. And, people have pointed to J.D. Vance's speech at the RNC, where he's railing against corporations, even though J.D. Vance is a venture capitalist who cut his teeth in the middle of Silicon Valley. But, we'll talk about that at a different podcast for a different time. But, one thing that I do hear is that this is a economic story that's really happening, and that the right-wing movements are happening because of a reaction to globalization, a reaction to sort of the excesses of capitalism, and then almost the intertwining of liberal values and, massive corporations, multinational corporations. And I think here in the United States, you did see that. And this is social values, I should say, not, economic liberal values, but that there was this mass pushback against the elites, the economic interest in that. But you write in the book that the economic story isn't quite the whole story, or even the story whatsoever. Elaborate a little bit more on what you were saying about the sort of the economics first account of why this is happening, and what that misses and what it maybe does get about the reactionary spirit.
Yeah, it's a really important question, because I think there are elements of that narrative that aren't wrong, right? Some academic studies have shown some effects on trade, of trade exposure, on voting patterns, a handful of things like that do matter at the margins. I think it's rising inequality really matters because it concentrates money in the hands of some elites who have a lot to lose by the system being changed. And those elites end up becoming the primary funders of reactionary political movements. But you referenced the term economics first that I use in the book. And I think economics first is an important way of putting it, because it posits that the primary driver of reactionary movements today is kind of displaced anger at inequality right? And that's not true. Right. It may matter on the margins, right? There might be a small number, or comparatively small number of people, maybe globally large, of people who have, lost their jobs due to deindustrialization and are very, very angry and voting for Donald Trump as a result of that. But typically that's more of a window dressing for what's actually happening, right?
Yeah.
And this has been
kind of an upending of the social order, usually.
Yeah, like, and if trade matters, it matters because it's a sign, like factory shuttering is a sign of visible change.
Right.
Of along with other changes, people who look different starting to move into a town or a metro area, speaking different languages, a guy who looks different being president of the United States, specifically a black man. And you can't say in theory which of these explanations, sort of social backlash or economic backlash, comes first. You have to look at the data, right? And that's what I did when I really have been doing this for almost a decade now of checking out the data on this, and it almost always points one way, which is that social causes matter more.
Yeah.
Right. There are a variety of different ways to slice this. But one thing that I find really helpful is that when political scientists do regression analyses, right, they look at multiple different variables and see what their effect is. The effect size of something like race or gender, that is someone's perceptions of race, metrics like racial resentment, which is a tool that political scientists use to measure people's racial attitudes without being like, are you racist? Yes or no, which is not an especially useful question, right? So they use the scale and they find that the degree that somebody holds racially resentful attitudes is way more predictive than any measure of their economic health or well-being. It often finds, a study might find some economic effects, but it turns out that when you can control for the effect of education, these often fall out. Now that's political science jargon, but to put it in more concrete language, right? Basically, you can be wealthy and not have a college degree and be much more likely to vote for Trump than someone who is either poor and has no college degree, or someone who is wealthy and has a college degree. That is to say,
because it's about like cultural circumstances around you.
Yeah. It's the level of education that matters more than income.
Sure.
Right. So one way to think about it is grad students who are not rich, right, often quite poor by national standards. They're still voting for Democrats, right? Because they're highly educated. But someone who owns 4 car dealerships and started working in that field right out of high school, they're going to show up as non-college, but they'll be quite wealthy. And that person is like the archetypal Trump voter. Like, don't think closed factories, think the boat parades that you've seen in Florida. Yeah. Of people going around, running around with flags. That's really what the sort of core demographic of Trumpism is. And I think that often falls out of the story.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good point because it is so much cultural. And I think going back to, what I was saying earlier is that was what was surprising to me is when you saw Republicans who've been very friendly to big business, for way past you and I have both been alive. But there was a backlash when there was a perception that these corporations were starting to espouse liberal values, whether that was Major League Baseball, letting players wear pride patches or, corporate DEI initiatives on Wall Street that people really rebelled to. And it's, it did kind of show that the cultural values were more important or more of a driving force for them to react than it was excess of wealth or things like that. I think it's very difficult to disentangle the role of race, ethnicity, identity from a lot of what is happening. And what I find interesting from your book is that, you look at a lot of different countries, and I see that particularly in the U.S., you talk about the Civil War era and the slavery era as a time when the reactionary spirit starts. You see that with Modi in India. We haven't talked yet about Netanyahu in Israel, but the role that race, immigration, I guess, if you will, a changing, visible national identity. How does that feed into the reactionary spirit? And where do you see that kind of cropping up in today's reactionary spirits?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's at the core of it in every country around the world that I look at, right? Is there's a sense that the country is no longer for people like them among supporters of reactionary political movements, that something has been lost. And that something needs to be regained. And the sense of what that something is very often bound up in visible lived experience of the society becoming one in which things don't work in the way that they used to and put the same people in charge and in visible positions in the way that it used to. Right. And so I focus in the book on Barack Obama's election because I think the presidency has a uniquely symbolic power. And there's a lot of political science evidence backing up the degree to which, just the identity of the guy in the White House, of there being a black man there, really changed the way people thought about politics. So it's I think that was an especially important inflection point, but it's not the only one, right? There were lots of structural determinants that went before this one particular event, and in different countries, it's different things. But it can even be things like you mentioned that point about, woke capitalism, as conservatives often term it now, right? What kinds of families show up in advertising can affect somebody's sense of place. Right? Who the the mascots are. Like there was that big boycott movement against Bud Light because they partnered with a trans influencer for one particular ad, right? To me, that shows the power of symbolic markers of acceptance in mobilizing reactionary backlashes. And I think people, liberals and people on the left are not good at understanding how much that matters to people on the right and how much that can fuel tremendous senses of unease and anger at the way that things have changed.
Yeah.
They often will say, oh, it's irrational. It's voting against their interests. How could anybody care about things like that? It seems so stupid. But for a lot of people, as you suggested, it's not stupid to them. To them, it speaks to their understanding of the nation changing at an elemental level.
Yeah, and a feeling of being left out of that transition, if you will, whether that's correct or not, that resentment in there.
Yeah. It's that people like me and values like mine aren't being represented in Washington or in the culture. And that is a really powerful reservoir to draw on. And it makes people feel really alienated from the political system. And in ways that often diverge from actual economic circumstance. Like one really striking study I looked at, again, this is an American study, but it looked at people who lived in rural areas and tried to identify and analyze what they call rural resentment, right? Is the sense that ruralities are locked out of political power and excluded from mainstream society dominated by coastal elites. And they found that there were a few different ways in which this was expressed. But one thing that they tried to track is the degree to which expressions of rural resentment correlated with Trump voting. And they found that in places where people were poorer and more upset about the distribution of resources, they were actually less likely to vote for Trump, people in those areas, than other people in other rural areas. Whereas when people in the areas expressed a cultural variant of rural resentment, right, when they were concerned about, feeling like this wasn't their society, they were much more likely to vote for Trump. That was positively correlated pretty strongly with Trump. And to me, that suggests it's not an economic phenomenon. It really, culture is a very, very profound and deep motivating capacity for people that we ignore at our peril.
Yeah, and I think it's the emotional, I don't want to say the emotional truth, but it is the emotional core of what a lot of people kind of form their worldviews around, and that leads to how they think about everything else. So taking that idea, looking at a place like Israel, because Israel is interesting to me in that I think and again, I could be very wrong, please correct me on this, but, on both the liberal side and the more conservative side, Israel is built around sort of a shared identity that this is a Jewish state. This was really built because of the pogroms, the Holocaust, the, centuries of oppression that people have felt. And yet in there, it does seem like Netanyahu sort of adheres to this reactionary spirit. But I remember you and David had a fascinating conversation about liberal Zionism. So in what way does Israel kind of fit into this idea that it is a cultural change that Netanyahu is reacting to and kind of leaping on? And is that something born out of culture, ethnicity, religion? How does this play out inside of Israel?
So Israel has always had a deep tension inside of its national identity, which is that it is a country that promises universal equality in some ways. It doesn't use the word equality, but it certainly aspires to be a liberal state in the way that its founding documents and original laws are structured. But it also is one premised on the idea that it's the nation state of a specific people. So how can it be a liberal democracy, but also an ethnic democracy for a certain group, right? There's a lot of tension there. And different Israelis, both, scholars and political figures have worked this out in different ways over the course of time. And a lot of the big picture of Israeli politics is which side of that ledger is winning and how it deals with the side that's losing, right? Is Israel a more liberal country, or is it a less liberal country and a more hardline Jewish one? So I think the crucial period here, I talked about this a little with David last time, is the 1990s, right? Because in the 1990s, you had two concerted efforts to bring Israel in line with its more liberal identity and develop a new vision for how that related to its Jewish identity. And you can see this in what was called the Constitutional Revolution, a series of court rulings in the mid-early 90s that kind of expanded the court's power to review legislation and often did so, not too often, but enough, did so to push the country in a more liberal direction. And part of that idea, as expressed by a man who's a longtime and famous Supreme Court justice, or Aharon Barak, was that Israel being a Jewish state didn't mean being a state that gave special rights and privileges to Jews per se, other than giving Jews unconditional immigration rights because of the fear of persecution abroad that you mentioned. It's that it was a country that used Jewish national symbols, right? It had used the Hebrew calendar. Hebrew was the national language. It had the holidays were Jewish holidays. It had all of these senses of Jewish identity in a way that made it meaningfully a Jewish state, but not one that said Jews have access to rights and privileges that other people can't have in all other ways. In fact, he argued that Judaism demanded that equal treatment of all citizens when it comes to civil and political rights. And so that vision of what it means to be a Jewish state, the trappings of Jewishness, a Jewish majority, and being a place of refuge for Jews persecuted abroad, was a distinctly liberal spin on Zionism, and one that was perfectly compatible with democracy. And it happened at the same time, I think very non-coincidentally, with the most serious effort to make peace with the Palestinians in Israeli history, right? The Oslo Accords, and then the subsequent negotiations. Because Israeli society was becoming open to the idea that it not just shouldn't, for its own reasons, be occupying Palestinian land, but that it would be an affirmative good, a moral obligation even, to develop peace with the Palestinians, to live side by side and not dominate an Arab population and impose what is essentially an authoritarian system of rule on them in the West Bank. And that was a version of Israel that could have been, I think. The problem is the peace process fell apart. The end consequence, whoever you want to blame for it, the reality is a series of increasingly vicious wars, the Gaza being taken over by Hamas and now leading to the current horrific conflict, the worst in the history of Israeli-Palestinian violence, at least modern history, when it can be defined as specifically Israeli-Palestinian rather than Israeli-Arab. And that the rise of violence and the failure of the peace process has really enabled Israeli reactionaries to say, we were right all along, right? This is a Jewish state and it needs to be a Jewish state, because if it's not an exclusively Jewish state, you won't be safe here. That's how we safeguard ourselves, is by protecting the dominance and the social power of Jews inside Israel and their control, sort of not quite exclusive, but close to exclusive control over the state. And that has fueled, in very concrete legal mechanisms to the occupation itself in the West Bank, a really major backsliding in Israeli democracy, one that's been on display during the current conflict as well.
Before we leave, I'd love to hear your sense of what happened in France, because France went through a moment where it seemed as if it could go to a reactionary hard right, Marine Le Pen. I believe her father was also a sort of right-wing reactionary. Ultimately, it didn't happen. When you were watching the French elections in that moment, what does that say to you about, the staying power of the reactionary spirit? And was that maybe a bulwark example against it?
Yeah, I think the French election is very interesting and worth breaking down in specifics. I'll start with the general point about it, which is the French election showed how when you feel that democracy is under threat, rightly or wrongly, that can be a unifying force for people across the political spectrum to rally in its defense. So the question is, right, like what happened? And the big answer is it was cooperation between Macron's centrist faction and the left. Not only did the left unite various different left-wing parties in one coalition, which is actually quite a feat, right? It ranged from the center-left socialists to some pretty far-left factions, including the Communist Party, all running under one ticket. But you also had an agreement with Macron or some kind of election-by-election agreements where candidates from one party or the other would drop out, so there wouldn't be three-way races with the far right, but rather that in basically every district, the far right would be in a one-on-one fight with either a party of the center, or a candidate of the center, or a candidate of the left. And that meant that there wasn't the kind of vote inefficiencies and vote splitting of people who oppose the far right. And the majority of French voters who really don't like them were given a chance to vote for something else. And that's what happened, right? They cooperated. They figured out how to work the electoral system to put together an anti-far right majority. And that's a model that other countries should be looking at when they're concerned about their own reactionary upsurges is what about my political system is like the rules that the French used that could allow me to coordinate with people that I disagree with fundamentally on lots of issues. Like, let's be clear, Macron and the left had huge policy disagreements.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
But
their shared thing was
yeah.
democracy, it felt like. And, and I'd be curious if in your research and all of this is different from the time period when fascism and dictatorships were rising, the pre-World War II and the World War II era. It feels that even the people who might be enticed by some of what the right-wing reactionaries are saying, fundamentally people want to live in a democracy, that the underlying values in the democracies, they want to elect their leaders, they want to have a say. And it might be more of, I'm not going to break down every single person as to why they're voting for someone on the right, but that seems to feel like a little bit of hope. And, I want to end on the example of Canada that you write about. Tell me a little bit about Canada and what happened there and how they sort of moved on from their reactionary moment.
Yeah, I mean, it's not so much a reactionary moment as it is a country that had a lot of difficulties in defining itself.
Yeah.
Right. Canada didn't really know what it was about for a lot of its history until recently. Canadians may or may not like me saying that, but that is it is the reality of the situation.
Well, you had pretty rough fights between the French Canadians and the English speaking Canadians. The Quebecois there was a secessionist movement where Montreal is to try and leave, right? Oh
yeah, there was a tremendous amount of violence during that time. Martial law declared in Quebec, or at least parts of it. And, that led Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, Justin's father, to formulate an official policy which eventually turned into the cornerstone of modern Canadian national identity, which is multiculturalism, right? The idea that Canada isn't just a country for one group of people, or for one set identity, but rather a variety of different ones operating inside harmony with no one particular identity dominating the other ones and putting them in subordinate positions. The way that this is often explained in Canadian schools is comparing it to the American melting pot model, where immigration to different populations merge into a unified whole that shares a certain identity that's taken on components of multiple different groups. The Canadians think of themselves as being in a salad bowl, right? They're all still separate ingredients, even if they're in the same bowl together, coexisting in a harmonious whole, but not being melted together.
That's what I call Los Angeles, but a lot of people tend to disagree with
me. Well, people may disagree, but this is like the textbook, like Canadians learn this in school, right? Kind of depiction of their country. And it's been an enormously successful project and giving Canadians something to unite around, something that really defines what Canada gives to the world. And it's a vision of equality and multiculturalism and social justice. So one Canadian, a conservative Canadian professor derisively calls Canada the world's first woke country. So he obviously doesn't like that, right? But I think that a more positive spin on it is Canada is the country, one of the countries that takes democracy's promise most seriously anywhere in the world, that really does take notions of political equality seriously and meets people where they are in treating them as equals, not trying to force them to act in a particular way or be a particular kind of person. And that's made Canada almost uniquely resistant to modern far-right anti-democratic politics, right? The current Conservative Party in Canada, the leader is by Canadian standards far right. I think that's fair to say, but he's also nothing like Trump or the AfD in Germany.
Does Canada have like a nativist, I wouldn't say an uprising, but do they have these nativist tremors that you've seen in the United States or in Hungary?
Yeah, but it's not even close in terms of power or potency, right? That definitely exists, and I don't want to pretend it doesn't, that Canada is a perfect country with no conflict over immigration, but it remains the case that immigration is, on a values level, especially popular. Arguments against immigration that have gotten traction only very recently, and I don't know how durable this is, has to do with housing prices. Housing in Canada is often quite expensive, and so they argue that we can't take in as many people as we've been taking in unless we can get the housing market under control. But, and that's, a different kind of anti-immigration argument than the one that works nearly anywhere else. And it's not one based on the idea that these people are a threat to our national identity or that things are changing too quickly. That's all of those arguments don't work. Right. They're not effective. Even the right-wing populists in Canada don't want to cut immigration for that reason. They attest to the ways in which diversity and multiculturalism are essential to Canadian identity. And that, to me, is a striking success. And it also manifests in limited challenges to the democratic system itself. Like, there's just not any evidence that even the current conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre, would steamroll democratic freedoms. There's like maybe one or two examples of bad policy ideas that he has relating to democracy, like cutting funding for the CBC, its central broadcaster. But A, I don't know if he'd be able to do that. And B, I mean, that's bad, but it's certainly not the same as firing the entirety of the civil service and replacing them with crony bureaucrats, as Trump is proposing to do in the next term. Or, going as far as Viktor Orban and gutting not only the civil service, but the judiciary, the election committee, everything, seizing control of the private sector media, all the things that modern authoritarians do to destroy democracy from the inside. There's not any evidence that would or is likely to happen in Canada anytime soon. And it speaks to the way in which changing one's values on diversity and multiculturalism provide a sort of vaccination against what I would call specifically reactionary politics, not just right-wing, but anti-democratic extreme right politics.
So I got an easy last question for you. How do we just do that here? I kid about that, but is it a top-down thing? Because what you said is my parents' story of immigrating to the United States is that the U.S. is an idea, the democracy is an idea, and that it is a multicultural promise of democracy, of freedom, of enterprise. It's not rooted in a religious or racial identity. But how does a country change like that?
So I don't think anyone should just try to be Canada, right?
Yeah.
The circumstances that led to Canada's adoption of official multiculturalism are complex and probably not replicable anywhere else. So that's not my suggestion. What I do think Canada should teach us is that appealing to core elements of a national identity can be immensely valuable and potent when those elements of identity cut against the appeal of authoritarian movements. And so in Canada, it's been bolstered by the ability to draw on a variety of different traditions, but the multiculturalism aspect being a bit at the top of the list. In a country like the United States, where that's more contested, right? You just saw J.D. Vance in his Republican convention speech say something like, America is not an idea, it's a place, right? And really building a kind of a blood and soil vision of American nationality. Almost literally, right? He talked about, about going to his grave and generations lie in graves, right? It really is about the blood of the people who've been here. United States, that's not, as you suggested, it's not historically been how the United States conceives of itself, at least in the majority. So when you want to make arguments that draw on the deep well of national consensus, that point of consensus is democracy in the US.
Yeah.
Not multiculturalism, but democracy, the idea of a self-determining polity. And so if you can show that what reactionary, and I think this is true, by the way, in a lot of other peer countries as well, not as deeply as it is in the United States, but in a lot of other democracies, there's generally a view that democracy is good. And that gives you a similar tool to official multiculturalism, not quite as potent, but still valuable in attacking these movements. Because what you can do is show the contrast, the gulf between what they say about supporting democracy and what their actual policies are, the concrete specific things that threaten the system. And in showing that gulf, you can do significant damage to these movements' political standing.
Well, Zack, thank you so much for this conversation. The book is The Reactionary Spirit. Thanks for joining Lever Time. This is awesome. Great to have you.
Thank you. I really loved it.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Lever Time. This episode was produced by me, Arjun Singh, with help from Chris Walker and editing support from Joel Warner and Lucy Dean Stockton. Our theme music was composed by Nick Campbell. We'll be back next week with another episode of Lever Time.